In this video, we're going to talk about some of the general characteristics of plants. And then in other videos, we are going to talk about vascular versus non-vascular plants and seedless plants versus plants that produce seeds. So first of all, taking a look at the general characteristics of plants. They are multicellular. So they are made up of multiple cells, and these cells cannot live independently of each other. So if you were to take a cell away from a multicellular organism, that individual cell will not be able to survive on its own. They are eukaryotes. And eukaryotes, remember, that means that they have a membrane-bound nucleus. They have other membrane-bound organelles. Including things like the endoplasmic reticuli, the Golgi apparatus, and mitochondria. Eukaryotic cells also have multiple linear chromosomes. And these chromosomes are organized with histone proteins. Plants are also photosynthetic, which we could also say that they are photoautotrophic. So remember that a photoautotroph, if we look at this word, photo means light, auto means self, and trophic or troph means to eat or feed. So plants are able to feed themselves using light as an energy source. And if you remember the overall equation of photosynthesis takes CO2, which is carbon dioxide, plus water, then there's an input of energy from light. In this case, we're talking about the sun. And it produces O2, which is oxygen gas, and carbohydrates. And we usually talk about the specific carbohydrate of glucose, which is C6H12O6. Now the plant can then take these carbohydrates and do cellular respiration. So essentially, plants make their own food, and then they break down that food in order to do cellular respiration. Remember that the main goal of cellular respiration is to produce ATP. Photosynthetic also means that plant cells have chloroplasts. And chloroplasts are one of those membrane-bound organelles that contains chlorophyll, and that's where photosynthesis occurs. So let's talk about how plants are classified taxonomically. So remember that the most encompassing or kind of the most general level of classification is the domain level. And we've talked about other domains before. We've talked about the domain bacteria and the domain archaea. And then we've already talked a little bit about the domain eukarya, because remember we talked about protists and fungi, which are also eukaryotes or made up of eukaryotic cells. And so plants are also going to fit into this domain, eukarya. Plants are lumped in with the supergroup known as Archaeplastida, and we talked about this when we talked about protists. Because remember, protists are classified in different supergroups, and one of those supergroups was the Archaeplastida. And we can actually see that right here on this chart. And you can see that plants are included in this supergroup, as are the green algae and red algae. Now, if we keep getting more and more specific as we move down the classification, plants are in the kingdom known as Plantae. We can further divide the plants into things like phyla and classes. And so we'll talk about those. Those are kind of the next levels of taxonomic classification. We'll talk about those as we talk about the different types of plants. But essentially, we can divide plants into non-vascular versus vascular. And then within the vascular classification, we can have seedless or seed-producing plants. And I should point out that non-vascular plants are also seedless. So first, let's take a look at the difference between non-vascular and vascular plants. And this probably seems obvious. So non-vascular plants do not have vascular tissue. Remember, a tissue is just a group of cells that work together to perform a function. So all multicellular living organisms have tissues, and plants, one of those tissues could be vascular tissue. And the vascular tissue is kind of classified as either xylem or phloem. And we'll talk more about these when we talk about vascular plants a little bit later on. Vascular plants do have the xylem and phloem. And you can kind of see on this picture over here that we have the xylem. And the xylem are just these vessels that help a plant to absorb water and minerals from the soil and then transport that water and minerals to all the different parts of the plant. The phloem primarily transports the carbs, so the carbohydrates, that are produced during photosynthesis. So photosynthesis typically occurs in the leaves. So the phloem has to transport those carbohydrates from the leaves to all the other tissues and cells within the plant. So here's the further classification of plants. So looking at non-vascular versus vascular plants. The non-vascular plants are collectively known as the bryophytes, but they actually include a couple of different phyla. And then one of the phylums, just to make it nice and confusing, is actually called Bryophyta. So the bryophytes are kind of, that term is used to discuss all of these different phyla, but the true bryophytes are these Bryophyta, which are the mosses. And we'll talk about those more in more detail in different videos. Now, the vascular plants, remember that all non-vascular plants are seedless, but the vascular plants can be seedless or they can produce seeds. So overall, we call the vascular plants the tracheophytes. And in this lesson, we are going to focus on the seedless vascular plants. So the seed-producing plants are going to be in a different chapter and in a different lesson. So we will talk about these different phyla and classes of seedless plants in more detail in future videos. So the next question is, how did land plants evolve? So they likely evolved from a freshwater green algae. Remember that green algae are classified as protists. Now there are a lot of similarities between green algae and plants. They both do photosynthesis, and they both have these pigments known as chlorophylls A and B. And these are those pigments that are involved in photosynthesis. Both plants and green algae store carbohydrates as starch. So starch is a polysaccharide. And both green algae and plants have cellulose in their cell walls. The major difference between the two is that plants protect the zygotes. So this is kind of like the baby cell, if you will, whereas algae don't do that. So the plants protect the zygotes in the developing embryos, which helps to increase their success during reproduction. The earliest land plants probably evolved about 500 million years ago. So MYA stands for million years ago. The earliest vascular plants showed up about 75 million years later, so about 425 million years ago. And the evolution of land plants really changed the atmosphere of the Earth. So at the time, there wasn't a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, but due to photosynthesis, plants produce oxygen. And so by increasing the amount of oxygen in the air, it ultimately allowed for the evolution of more complex animals, because remember, animals need oxygen for cellular respiration. Now, there are benefits to living on land versus living in the water. So living in the water gives you certain benefits, but then there are also some downsides. Same thing with life on land. So some benefits of these plants basically evolving to live on land is that they have abundant sunlight. And so the water actually filters out a lot of sunlight. So the algae are kind of limited. They can only survive in kind of the shallower water, because the deeper you go, the less sunlight is reaching those deeper waters. Carbon dioxide is also really abundant and more readily available in air than water. Now remember, plants need carbon dioxide to do photosynthesis. And when land plants first evolved, there weren't any herbivores, so there weren't animals to eat the plants. So they basically had no competition, they had no predators, and so they could just grow and reproduce without any problems. But as I mentioned, there are benefits of living in the water as well. So algae are kind of plant relatives, are aquatic, so they have to live in water. And here are the benefits that water provides. So protection from desiccation. Desiccation just means drying out. So if you're surrounded by water, you don't have to worry about becoming dehydrated. Water also provides buoyancy and support. If you've ever pulled algae out of the water, you know that it kind of turns into like a limp, slimy mess in your hand. There often isn't a lot of structure to it because it doesn't need structure in the water. Water also helps to protect algae and aquatic plants from UV radiation. And UV radiation, so this is radiation that comes from the sun, and it can be mutagenic. And what that means is that it can damage DNA. And by damaging DNA, it can cause things like mutations, which can lead to problems including cancer. So in the water helps to filter out a lot of the UV radiation, but plants on land don't have that water protection, so they had to figure out how to survive that increase in UV radiation. In the water, the algae are also surrounded by water and nutrients, so it's very easy for them to get nutrients. They can just absorb nutrients across their tissues. So land plants had to adapt in order to survive on land because they don't have the benefits of living in the water. So one problem with moving to land is desiccation. Remember, desiccation is just drying out or dehydration. So the solution that evolved is the development of a waxy cuticle, which we can see in this picture here. And this waxy cuticle kind of forms a barrier across the plant's tissues in order to keep water in. And that cuticle provides a kind of a waxy cover that helps to keep moisture from evaporating out of the plant. Now, with the development of this waxy cuticle, it also created another problem, though, and the problem had to do with gas exchange. Because remember that plants take in carbon dioxide, and they take that in to conduct photosynthesis, and then they give off oxygen. So the carbon dioxide has to have a way of getting into the plant cell, and the oxygen has to have a way of getting out of the plant cell. So the solution that evolved is the development of these things called stomata, which singular is known as a stoma. And you can see that on this picture here. Sorry, I wrote over the word stoma. But it's basically this little opening or pore in the plant leaf or tissue that can open and close in order to allow gas exchange to occur. So we can see in this picture over here that if we were to look at a plant leaf under a microscope, this is what those stomata look like. So there are these guard cells here that are around that open pore. All right, so this open stomata is the opening that carbon dioxide and oxygen can move through. And those guard cells can actually swell up in order to close the stoma, or they can basically relax in order to open it up. Another problem plants faced when they were no longer aquatic is that all cells need access to water, because water is needed as a solvent and also for chemical reactions to occur. So one solution that evolved is the development of vascular tissue. As vascular tissue is made up of these cells called tracheids. So in non-vascular plants, they have to stay close to the ground, close to the water, and they typically have to live in humid places so that they can have access to enough water to survive. But vascular plants developed the xylem and phloem in order to be able to move water around. And so water, especially with the xylem, water can be absorbed by the roots and then transported up the stem and to the leaves of the plant. Additional adaptations occurred in plants kind of like cacti or succulents that help to reduce water loss. These adaptations include things like decreased surface area. So cacti don't really have leaves. They have a photosynthetic stem, and then their leaves have been modified to form the spikes or the thorns. They also have a really thick cuticle, the ability to store water, etc., etc. Another problem that land plants had to face is gravity. So remember, water provides buoyancy for things like algae, but on land, if plants wanted to be able to grow tall, they needed to have something to support them. The cells in the vascular tissue actually contain this polymer known as lignin, and this is a molecule, and it's a tough molecule that helps to give the cells of the plant, well, the cells of the vascular tissue, support so that a plant can grow tall. Also, because land plants are not continuously surrounded by water, they developed this tissue known as an apical meristem. And what this apical meristem tissue is it's stem cells. And these stem cells are constantly undergoing mitosis. And so this allows for growth. And this tissue is associated with the roots and the shoots of the plant. And so, for For example, if a plant is in an area that's really dry, it can actually start growing its roots and extending it until it can find water. And you've probably seen that, some plants have really extensive root systems that have really spread out through the soil because it's trying to grab water either deeper down in the soil or further away from where it is. In the shoots, this allows the plant to grow taller in order to access more sunlight as well. Another problem land plants face when they move to land is UV radiation. Remember we said that UV radiation is part of the electromagnetic radiation that comes from the sun, and it can damage DNA, causing mutations to occur. And some of these mutations could be detrimental, potentially harming the plant. So, one solution that plants developed in order to overcome this issue is this kind of concept of alternation of generations life cycle. And essentially, the more prevalent stage of the life cycle of the plants is a diploid stage. And if you remember, diploid we can also call 2N. And if you go back and review things like mitosis and meiosis that occurs in humans, remember that 2N just means, or diploid means that there are two sets of chromosomes present. All right, you typically get one set from the maternal gamete and one set from the paternal gamete. So due to this, we often kind of draw this as kind of these bar-shaped chromosomes here being different colors. So we could say that maybe the blue ones came from the paternal gamete and the red ones came from the maternal gamete. And essentially what happens, and if you think back to learning about basic genetics, when you have these paired chromosomes, it means that you have two alleles or two copies of each gene. And these copies might be slightly different from each other. Remember with genetics, you probably learned about homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. So the copies might have the same information or they might have slightly different information from each other. And essentially by having this diploid lifestyle, having these paired chromosomes, it helped to decrease the likelihood that damage was going to cause a major problem. Because if UV radiation mutated one allele, the other allele might still be okay and able to produce the protein that it is coding for. So you can think of having two alleles as having almost like a spare allele. So one allele might become mutated, and then the second allele might not be mutated and it might be okay and still able to produce the protein that it's coding for. Because remember, genes are the recipes for proteins. And we're going to take a look at this diagram and explain what we mean by the alternation of generations in its own video, because it's kind of a complicated topic, so it deserves its own video.